in Finland, the right to housing is not very explicit. It's explicit only for certain specific groups. In the Finnish constitution, it says that there's a subjective right for housing for people with disabilities and young people who are leaving the foster care. But there are a lot of things that point to the same direction. And actually, in the Finnish context, right to housing is seen as a part of the right to income and social security and social welfare. So it's part of a wider context, and there's a lot of legislation that actually means that there is a right to housing in the Finnish society. But we are mainly been focusing on making this right to housing a reality, which means that there are several things that have been done. For example, especially the national program to reduce long-term homelessness has been important. But it's a wider context. It's a part of the social welfare system. I think that in the Finnish context, the main thing has been that we have been focusing very much on a pragmatic solutions to make housing rights a reality for Finnish citizens. So actually the legislative framework has not been so important. It has been sufficient, but there has not been any new developments in the legislation in recent years concerning housing rights in Finland. Young people living in the foster care who have been in the custody of the state, they have the subjective right to housing, and this is up till 25 years. This is nowadays the legislation that you have a right to housing and the necessary care, which means also providing the necessary minimum income for you. We have a system of building affordable social housing for young people in Finland. There's a specific legislation concerning this housing, which means that when you make the rental agreement, you have to be under 30 years old, and you can stay in this affordable housing until you are 35 years old. So in most of the big cities, there are every year new housing built for young people. So this is, once again, it's not a legal obligation for the municipalities or service providers, but it is the part of how we see it, that how to implement right to housing and in practice. There's one thing that in the legislation that was very important when we started the program to reduce long-term homelessness in Finland. And the Finnish constitution, although it doesn't guarantee a subjective right to housing for everybody, it guarantees a right to privacy. And this was the legal argument that we used when we stated that we have to get rid of temporary accommodation in shelters and hostels because it doesn't provide privacy for citizens. And this was actually very useful in the context when we implemented Housing First, which is based on permanent housing instead of temporary accommodation in shelters and hostels. From our point of view, it's important to see the right to housing not as a specific issue only, but in a wider context. And it means that people have to have the means also to sustain the housing. And for that reason, for example, the parallel legislation concerning social welfare is extremely important. I don't want to say that it's only in the Nordic welfare system it's possible to end homelessness, but there is a certain link between housing rights. To make housing rights a reality, it requires also some other legislation. and I see this legislation concerning, for example, necessary income, whatever the system is in different countries, as a necessary requirement for implementing housing rights in reality. Otherwise, there is a risk that it becomes or stays on a only in the jurisdiction, and that's not enough to make it a reality. It's a necessary first step to have this kind of legislation, but it doesn't solve the issue yet. Housing legislation concerning housing rights, if it's not at the same time, if not on the same time, there's on the table the housing policy and what's necessary in the housing policy to provide the necessary amount of affordable social housing. I think it's very paradoxical if you have a very progressive legislation, but at the same time, in reality, you can see that there are no means how to implement that in practice, because in the society you are lacking the affordable social housing. So these things also have to be linked. Once again, you have to look at the bigger picture, not only specific legislation concerning housing rights, but the reality of the housing policy and the welfare legislation and welfare policy at the same time. A more holistic approach should be needed. If you start to implement right to housing, there's inside this thinking, there is the idea that we should have no homelessness. And for that reason, there should be some kind of political understanding or vision. What are the means how you can end homelessness? And the right to housing, of course, is one part of that, an important part of that picture. I would say that the main thing is a cooperation between or partnership between different authorities. And in the Finnish context, it has been the state authorities, the local authorities, municipalities, and also NGOs providing supported services for homeless people who need it. So there are this kind of, first of all, a very wide consensus, common understanding what should be done to end homelessness, and also in practice in implementing these plans to end homelessness, the partnership between different organizations in different levels. We have realized that there are a lot of things that can be done within the current legislation, which is in many ways it dates from the 1980s already. So it has not prevented us from in practice doing things that make housing rights more a reality for people, Finnish people. This is it's not a paradise, but I think that there are things that we have done quite well, and I think that we have the understanding what's really the main issue in ending homelessness, and it's a systemic change from temporary accommodation in shelters and hostels into permanent housing solutions, and if necessary with support. But this transition from temporary accommodation to permanent housing, this is the way how homelessness can be ended for good.